The subcommittees on healthcare, benefits, administrative rules, and government operations will come to order without objection. The presiding member is authorized to declare recess at any time. We'll get to our witnesses here in a second. We'll do some opening statements and then hear their testimony, but we appreciate everyone being with us this morning, especially our three important witnesses. Today is tax day, deadline for American taxpayers to file their taxes with the Internal Revenue Service. We have before us the Acting Commissioner of the IRS, its Inspector General, and the National Taxpayer Advocate, all who play a role in taxpayer service, tax enforcement, IRS oversight, and implementing the tax code with fairness and integrity. Integrity at the IRS is something I want to address in particular today, something former Commissioner John Koskinen disregarded. As was made clear to this committee during his tenure, as he tried to cover up IRS targeting of conservative groups. While under subpoena, 422 backup tapes potentially containing up to 24,000 emails were conveniently destroyed. Continued shortcomings make it difficult for taxpayers to trust the IRS. At our most recent hearing about the IRS mismanagement, we learned that the agency rehired bad employees who engaged in fraud, who were under investigation, and who repeatedly violated internal policies and the law. In January, we wrote to the IRS to ensure this problem has been fixed. Today, we plan to hear an update on whether full compliance is actually in place. But we are seeing repeated failures. There's yet another report issued in February highlighting the IRS continues to give bonuses to employees who've had all kinds of shortcomings in their record, with recent misconduct and tax compliance issues as part of those shortcomings. Only at the IRS are bad employees, those with conduct issues, unauthorized access to taxpayer information, rewarded with bonuses. Another area of concern is the IRS's implementation of the employer mandate. In April of 2017, TIGTA assessed the IRS was not capable of starting to implement Obamacare's employer shared responsibility provision, finding processes were not functioning. But then in March, TIGTA issued a report finding that the process to identify employers subject to the employer mandate needed improvement. The Inspector General is reporting problems for the IRS enforcing the employer mandate, yet last November, when Mr. Koskinen was heading out the door, the IRS decided to start collecting penalties from companies going all the way back to 2015. I know many members have concerns about this, and we'll have questions about this, in particular Congressman Heiss from Georgia. This month, we requested documents about the IRS's capacity to evaluate compliance and assess penalties regarding the employer mandate. In 2016, the Government Accountability Office released a report suggesting that the IRS is systematically evading the law when issuing their expansive regulations. In February, we requested documents from Treasury about IRS rulemaking practices. Mr. Cotter, I'm still waiting for those documents. We need to hear how these and other issues will be resolved. The American people are tired of this pattern of IRS abuse. It is time for the Internal Revenue Service to fulfill its duties with fairness and integrity. Thank you to our witnesses for appearing here today on Tax Day, and I look forward to your testimony. And with that, I think we'll allow our Democrat colleagues, the ranking members, to offer their opening statements if they wish when they arrive. But I will turn now to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Heiss, for an opening statement, and then we'll get right to our witnesses.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you mentioned, today is one of the most dreaded days in America, Tax Day, and I hope that the recent passage of the tax reform bill will provide relief to the American citizens and hopefully less dread in the future as this day comes upon them. Not only does this hearing allow us to continue our oversight of the IRS, but it's also the first since the passage of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. And so this is particularly good timing for the hearing that we have today. The new tax cuts are critical to individuals and small businesses, and the IRS must move quickly to implement that law. It's my sincere hope that the culture and the management problems that have proven so prevalent at the IRS throughout the course of previous administrations does not imperil the implementation of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Acts and the reforms that are in it. The IRS has been entrusted with the most powerful tools of the federal government. I think it's safe to say that nothing strikes fear in the heart of a person like receiving a letter from the IRS. And the abuses that have taken place in the past are unacceptable. I personally have experienced the aggressive IRS tactics prior to running for office. In fact, as a pastor, I joined a group of other pastors that since then has turned into thousands of pastors to fight to resist the IRS intimidation and their chilling efforts to chill freedom of speech in churches. That fight, of course, is still ongoing. 98% of tax compliance is voluntary. This means that the IRS must work with, not against, taxpayers. This starts with ensuring taxpayers receive the best customer service possible at every level. I'm sure the witnesses today will probably say that the IRS needs more money to provide better services. I disagree with that personally, but nonetheless, Congress has provided additional resources this year to improve customer service and implement tax reforms. But we've got to be clear that these additional funds cannot be used as an opportunity for the IRS to sweep its long-standing problems under the rug. To quote taxpayer advocate, limited resources cannot be used as an all-purpose excuse for mediocrity. It's time for the IRS to hold itself to the same high standards that it requires of the American taxpayers. And this committee, I can assure you, will be watching closely. I want to thank our witnesses for being here today. I look forward to hearing your testimony. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Now recognize the gentleman from Virginia for an opening statement.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess I couldn't disagree more vehemently than with my friend who just spoke. Year after year, the IRS has been asked to do more with less. Since 2010, when the Republicans took over Congress, the number of individual tax returns filed increased by 11%, while the IRS budget, in inflation terms, decreased by 20%. That might have something to do with the mediocrity that was just characterized. These funding reductions have substantially weakened the agency's capacity to enforce the tax code and meet taxpayer needs. And in fact, it looks like it's deliberate. Over the same time, the IRS workforce has been reduced by 18,000, leaving one-third the number of enforcement agents and less than half the number of customer service representatives. That might have something to do with customer service quality. In her written testimony for today's hearing, Nina Olson, the taxpayer advocate, states, "There's no substitute for having enough IRS employees to answer the 100 million telephone calls and 10 million pieces of correspondence the IRS receives every year. The IRS budget constraints are impeding the agency's ability to update its outdated IT systems, something this committee on a bipartisan basis has been concerned about, delaying more than $200 million in investments. Approximately 59% of the information technology systems at the IRS have aged beyond their useful life, leaving the IRS and taxpayers at risk of a cyber intrusion or a catastrophic failure that prevents taxpayers from filing tax-related paperwork. The recently passed Trump tax scheme will only exacerbate these issues in the coming years. The law contains 119 provisions that must be addressed by the IRS, and it's estimated to cost the agency $397 million to implement. This figure includes the need to hire over 1,700 new employees, reprogram approximately 140 IT systems, revise or create roughly 450 different tax forms and publications and instructions, issue guidance, and other activities to help taxpayers comply with the new law. In the recently passed omnibus spending bill, as my friend did indicate, Congress did provide IRS a total of $11.4 billion for fiscal year 2018, an increase of $196 million over the previous fiscal year. Despite an increase of $196 million, funding for the IRS is still below the $12.1 billion the agency received before the Republicans took over the Congress in 2010. Now, despite all these increased responsibilities with the new tax code, they're still below their funding level of 8 years ago. Additionally, the omnibus directs the IRS to spend $320 million to implement changes in that new tax law, which means that funding for other IRS functions will probably have to be reduced to meet that requirement. So net new funding for normal IRS activities actually goes down. The increased funding in fiscal 2018 will do little to address the need for increased enforcement capacity or the well-documented customer service problems my friend just talked about that have plagued the IRS. This week, the House will vote on legislation that includes new IT and cyber requirements for the IRS. The 21st Century Irs Act would, among other things, promote electronically filed tax returns, enforce strict standards for confidentiality safeguards among IRS contractors, and strengthen efforts to combat identity theft. If Congress wants the IRS to deploy 21st century technology to improve services it provides, we must provide adequate resources to enable it to do so. However, it's important to recognize that new technology alone cannot replace the nearly 9,500 customer service representatives that the IRS has lost since fiscal year 2010. For example, 46% of taxpayers calling the IRS have already checked IRS online resources and still need assistance. Depending on online resources also ignores the millions of households across the country that have no broadband access, especially low-income and elderly taxpayers. Additionally, those who reach out to the IRS by phone or through a taxpayer assistance center often have more complicated issues that can't easily be addressed simply online. Therefore, while I support efforts to modernize the IRS IT systems, in fact, I passionately advocate for it, these efforts must be done in conjunction with, not at the exclusion of, increasing customer service employees needed to answer those phones and provide thoughtful guidance to taxpayers. I hope my colleagues on both sides of the aisle will recognize that our constituents deserve better, and now's the time to fully and adequately fund the IRS so it can do so. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Today we have before us Mr. David Cotter, Acting Commissioner of the Internal Revenue Service. We welcome you here for the first time, Mr. Cotter, and look forward to your testimony and your participation with the questions from our members. Mr. George, the Inspector General for the Treasury and for Tax Administration. He's been in front of our committee many times. We welcome you back, Mr. George. And of course, Ms. Olson is also Nina Olson, the National Taxpayer Advocate at the IRS, has been in front of us several times as well. We welcome you back and look forward to all your testimony. You know how it works. You got to stand up and we swear you in, and then you get your 5 minutes. So if you'll please stand, raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear to affirm, swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record show each witness answered in the affirmative. And Mr. Cotter, we're going to start with you. You got 5 minutes, and then we'll move right down the list.
Chairman Jordan and Meadows, ranking members Krishnamurthy and Connolly, and members of the subcommittees, thank you for the opportunity to provide you with an update on IRS operations. My appearance today is particularly appropriate since, as has been noted, this is tax day and the filing deadline is at midnight tonight. In case you haven't filed yet, just a reminder that we have a 6-month extension request available on irs.gov. Look for Form 4868. As of last Friday, 119 million returns have been filed and refunds have gone out quickly to more than 86 million taxpayers so far. About 92% of the returns have been filed electronically, and the average refund is up by $16 from last year to $2,831. Visits to irs.gov are up by 24%. On my way over here this morning, I was told that a number of IRS systems are unavailable at the moment. We are working to resolve this issue, and taxpayers should continue to file their returns as they normally would. Having said that, this year's tax season is a good example of what the IRS must do more of going forward, delivering for the nation's taxpayers. Following 5 months on the job at the IRS, I would like to share with you my observations about the IRS so far and offer a few thoughts about how to improve its performance in the future. When I agreed to Secretary Mnuchin's request to serve as the acting IRS commissioner, I told him that if I was going to bring value to this role, I needed to approach my responsibilities with an analytical, unbiased perspective, and that is what I've tried to do. At one point in my career, I served on the Senate staff, but most of my career, more than 4 decades, has been spent as a tax practitioner running large business units within a Big 4 firm. I spent 13 of those years as the Director of National Tax within my firm, and after leaving public accounting, I spent 4 years as a full-time professor at American University, where I established a tax center focused on small businesses and middle-income taxpayers. I frequently dealt with the IRS throughout my career, and I like to think I came to the IRS with an objective, unbiased view of the tax agency. Clearly, the IRS has had significant difficulties during the past 5 years, both from an internal operations point of view and when it comes to dealing with taxpayers. Those difficulties have been well documented by these subcommittees, TIGTA, and others. As I've met with people at the IRS, I have several observations that I'd like to share with you today. First, my personal experience is that the vast majority of its employees and its current career senior leadership are committed to helping taxpayers, to operating an efficient agency, and to doing the right thing. They realize they need to do better, and they realize they need to serve taxpayers, not the other way around. Second, I've found the senior career leadership currently in place to be open-minded, forward-thinking, and willing to implement change. It's worthwhile to keep in mind that the vast majority of the leadership now in place at the IRS is new. The Deputy Commissioner for Services and Enforcement has been in her job just over a year. The Deputy Commissioner, which is the second of the two primary Deputy Commissioners, has been in his job for a little over 2 years. And most of the leaders of our internal operations and support functions have been in place for less than 2 years. This is a group that seems not only open to change, but eager to change. Having said that, my view is that the path to improvement involves the critical elements of leadership, measurement, and accountability. These are areas where the IRS must do better. At this point, my belief is that there are 6 key things that need to change at the IRS, and all flow from the elements I just mentioned. First and foremost, the IRS needs to make improvements in taxpayer service to help taxpayers meet their obligations under the tax law. While enforcement is important, leadership needs to make clear that taxpayer assistance and enforcement are part of a continuum and not mutually exclusive concepts. Second, for our operations support work, we need to be clear that we must be judicious stewards of taxpayer dollars. While following the many rules of contracting, hiring, and firing are important, developing new ways of operating more efficiently, especially when it comes to software development, technology, and cybersecurity, are not a nice-to-have, they are part of the job. Third, measurements that determine whether various parts of the IRS are facilitating compliance with the law and being careful stewards of taxpayer dollars are critical. Fourth, there needs to be accountability. I cannot stress this enough. That has not been a strength of the IRS in recent years. Fifth, the IRS needs to be adequately funded, but with oversight. Finally, the cardinal rule of organizational management is that structure follows strategy. I would consider restructuring the IRS in a manner that facilitates a focus on taxpayer service and operational efficiency. I think the IRS is heading in the right direction, but there's still a long way to go. For example, I think the IRS is doing a solid job implementing tax reform, but that promises to be a lengthy and intensive effort. And with the tax deadline approaching tonight, I think the work of the IRS this filing season is an encouraging sign of the agency's commitment to taxpayers. As someone who's been in this business for over 40 years, I'm impressed that the IRS has delivered an extremely smooth filing season so far in view of the legislation enacted in February, which required the IRS to adjust its systems after the tax filing season had begun. IRS has answered 23 million taxpayer questions this filing season. The average hold time this filing season is less than 6 minutes, down a minute from last year. I think the IRS needs to do better in a range of areas. The IRS needs to do more, it needs to continue to get better, and it needs to enhance accountability. Chairman Jordan and Meadows, Ranking Members Krishnamurthy and Connolly, and members of the subcommittees, that concludes my statement. I'd be happy to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cotter. Mr. George, you're up.
Chairman, ranking members, members of both subcommittees, thank you for the opportunity to provide a status report on the 2018 filing season and other challenges facing the IRS. A continuing challenge the IRS faces each year in processing tax returns is the implementation of tax law changes. The recent Tax Cuts and Jobs Act will result in significant changes to both business and individual income taxes. The IRS indicates that implementation will require it to create or revise about 450 forms, publications, and instructions. Moreover, the IRS estimates that 140 information technology systems will require modification. TICTR's initial assessment found that the IRS used several well-established processes to immediately begin implementing the new provisions. This assessment was the first of a series of reviews we will be conducting to monitor the IRS's efforts to implement the first major tax reform legislation in more than 30 years. The IRS is projecting its toll-free telephone level of assistance to be 80% for this year's filing season, a slight increase from the 79% achieved last year. The IRS also plans to assist 3 million taxpayers at tax assistance centers, a 9% decrease from last fiscal year. For the 2018 filing season, the IRS transitioned all of its taxpayer assistance centers to an appointment service model. Although the IRS reports that it had 363 tax assistance centers, 24 are not open because they have not been staffed. Improper payments are another continuing challenge the IRS encounters. The IRS now receives wage documents earlier in the filing season, but the law does not give the IRS authority to systematically adjust refundable credits when the income used to compute the credit is not supported by third-party income documents. We estimate the IRS issued nearly $25 billion in improper payments associated with refundable credits in fiscal year 2017. It is unlikely that this situation will improve significantly without additional authority or compliance resources. As the IRS continues to expand its online tools to assist taxpayers, the risk of unauthorized access to taxpayer accounts increases. As such, it is critical that the methods the IRS uses to authenticate individuals' identities provide a high level of confidence that tax information and services are provided only to authorized individuals. The IRS spends a significant amount of time and resources combating external attempts to compromise our nation's tax system. However, our work has shown that more actions are needed to address internal threats. Hiring employees of high integrity is critical to the IRS protecting taxpayer information from internal threats. In 2 separate reports, we found that the service rehired hundreds of employees with prior conduct and performance issues. Hiring employees with serious financial problems and integrity issues and giving them access to taxpayer information is a risky practice that must end. In response to our 2014 report, the IRS said its process was more than adequate to mitigate risks to America's taxpayers. However, in July of 2017, we reported that the IRS had not effectively implemented our past recommendations and rehired more than 200 former employees who were previously terminated from the IRS or who had separated while under investigation for conduct or performance issues. The IRS has agreed to perform a follow-up audit, has agreed to the recommendations, rather, from our July 27 report, which we will follow up with an audit later this year. The IRS has also provided awards to employees with misconduct, including the federal compliance issues relating to tax. Using taxpayer funds to reward IRS employees with tax problems sends the wrong message to the vast majority of taxpayers who pay their taxes in full and on time. In March of 2014, we reported that the IRS provided $2.8 million in monetary awards to more than 2,800 employees disciplined for recent conduct issues. In February of this year, we reported that the IRS had made progress in this area. However, we did find that nearly 2,000 current employees with tax compliance or misconduct issues received more than $1.7 million in awards. The IRS has also agreed to our recommendations relating to awards. In conclusion, TICTA plans to provide continuing audit coverage of the IRS's efforts to provide high-quality service to taxpayers and to operate efficiently and effectively. Chairman, ranking members, members of the subcommittee, this ends my statement. Thank you for the opportunity to share my views.
Thank you, Mr. George. Ms. Olson, you're recognized.
Mr. Chairman and ranking members of the subcommittees, Thank you for inviting me to testify today at today's hearing on IRS operations. As you well know, Congress has passed the most comprehensive tax law reform since 1986. The IRS faces serious challenges as it implements and administers the new law, ranging from issuing guidance to creating new forms and publications to answering basic questions about the new law. The stakes are high for both taxpayers and the IRS. The IRS is dedicating significant resources to these efforts, and my office will continue to support the IRS to ensure that taxpayers have the information and assistance they need to comply with the new tax law. Tax reform notwithstanding, the IRS still must fulfill its continuing tax administration duties. Since fiscal year 2010, the IRS budget has been reduced by 20% on an inflation-adjusted basis, and the IRS workforce has declined about that same percentage. These reductions have led to significant cuts in taxpayer service levels, including a 23% decline in the number of employees conducting pre-filing taxpayer assistance and education. Moreover, these cuts have prevented the IRS from deploying new technology that would improve the taxpayer experience, including customer callback technology. While the IRS generally ran a smooth 2018 filing season, this morning notwithstanding, especially given the mid-season enactment of extender provisions, taxpayers were burdened by an overly restrictive appointment-only system at the taxpayer assistance centers and inconsistent service on phone lines. The IRS's official measure of telephone service, its Account Management Customer Service Representative Level of Service, or LOS, excludes the significant majority of taxpayer telephone calls the IRS receives. In fiscal year 2017, the official LOS reflected the results of only 32% of IRS calls. Thus, unlike the official LOS of 79% for the accounts management lines, the FY18 LOS for calls to the installment agreement balance due line was only 50%. These are people calling to make payments to us. The IRS's response to its resource constraints has been to push taxpayers to online self-service. Now, I have long advocated that the IRS develop an online account application, but it must be positioned as just one component of an omni-channel service strategy, including telephone and in-person assistance. Taxpayers must be the focus of this strategy, and their needs and preferences paramount. In 2016 and 17, TASC conducted a nationwide survey of U.S. taxpayers about their needs, preferences, and experiences with IRS taxpayer service. The survey results confirm that taxpayers choose different channels of communication to accomplish different types of service tasks. We found that about 41 million U.S. taxpayers do not have broadband access in their homes. About 50% disagreed with the statement, "I feel secure sharing personal financial information over the internet." 46% of taxpayers calling the IRS already checked IRS online resources and still needed assistance. And we found the single biggest driver of customer satisfaction is the first contact resolution rate, yet almost 40% of taxpayers calling the IRS felt one call did not fully resolve their problems. Another filing season problem is the unacceptably high false positive rates, or FPRs, associated with IRS's identity theft and fraud detection filters. While the IRS has improved its detection of questionable refund returns, it has not devoted the same level of attention to preventing false positives, resulting in significant delays or freezes of refunds due to hundreds of thousands of legitimate taxpayers filing legitimate returns. In 2017, the FPR was over 60% for both identity theft and non-identity theft filters, and the rate will be higher this year. High FPRs harm legitimate taxpayers and create unnecessary and often manual work for the IRS and for the Taxpayer Advocate Service. Our cases in this area have increased 98% this year over last year. The IRS can, while stopping fraud, can also reduce false positives. It can and should be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. Finally, the current state of IRS technology substantially limits the IRS's ability to carry out effective tax administration. As an example, the IRS possesses the two oldest information system databases, each nearly 6 decades old, in the entire federal government. Today, no IRS employee, much less the taxpayer or the taxpayer's representative, has a 360-degree view of the taxpayer's account and interactions with the IRS. Improving taxpayer service and IRS operations generally requires a combination of strong leadership and adequate resources. I encourage Congress to provide more funding to the IRS to improve taxpayer service and modernize its technology, and to pair that funding with sufficient oversight to ensure the funds are well spent. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Olson. Now recognize the gentleman from Georgia for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Cotter, the IRS decided to begin enforcing the employer mandate this past fall as Commissioner Koskinen was leaving office. This was the first time that the IRS ever actually enforced that employer mandate since the law came into existence in 2010. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
If you would hit you.
Yes, sir, that's correct.
Okay. And at this point, as I understand, your agency is issuing penalty letters to employers. I understand somewhere in the ballpark of 9,000 or so letters have been sent out. Is that right?
Yes, sir, it's around 10,000 at this point.
Around 10,000. Okay. Were these employers notified prior to receiving a penalty letter? I mean, after all, we're talking years of no enforcement, and then all of a sudden, this is a pretty big change coming down the pipe. These employers are accustomed to this employer mandate not being enforced. Were they notified beforehand?
No, the letter's the first they've heard from the IRS on this.
Okay. That sounds pretty harsh, to say the least, for these folks to be living for years under no enforcement and then all of a sudden being slapped with it. Mr. George, TIGTA has examined the IRS's ability to enforce the employer mandate, and I understand that you have found multiple problems with the enforcement systems for that employer mandate. Is that correct?
That is correct, Congressman.
Okay, can you briefly explain what some of those problems are?
Yes. Our review of the IRS's process to identify tax year 2015 applicable large employers potentially liable for the employer shared responsibility payment found that the IRS did not identify 840 employees potentially subject to more than $113 million in employer shared responsibility payments. Now, the difference in identified applicable large employers occurred because the data used by the IRS were not complete or accurate. We subsequently made 5 recommendations to improve the process. The IRS agreed with all 5 of those recommendations, and we certainly shall follow up with them to see if they've enacted those changes.
Okay, so change is coming, but would you be able to say with a strong degree of confidence right now that the IRS is effectively and accurately enforcing the employer mandate?
I would say this, sir. When the IRS puts its mind to something, it gets the job done.
Well, but that's not my question. You said they've got problems. Those problems have not, the solution to those problems have not yet been implemented. So the assumption I have is at this point they can't, with confidence, say that this is being handled effectively and accurately.
Until we've had a chance to analyze the actions taken, that is correct, sir.
Sure, okay. Mr. Cotter, are you familiar with the President's Executive Order 13765?
Yes, sir.
Okay, and you understand that basically that directs the federal agencies to ease the financial burdens of the Affordable Care Act?
Yes, sir.
Okay, is the IRS subject to that executive order?
It is.
Okay. It seems to me pretty obvious that it is rather burdensome for employers having no previous communication whatsoever to all of a sudden be forced with penalties on the employer mandate. Would you agree with that?
I would.
Okay. So, so based on your testimony and based on the executive order, why would the IRS be rushing to enforce the employer mandate?
Sure. So let me give you a little bit of background if I can.
Not too much. I've got less than a minute.
Okay.
I still have
All
some
right.
questions.
At this point, the letters are the IRS best estimate of what the employers owe. There have been constant negotiations as those letters have gone out. About 3,000 of the 10,000 letters that have gone out cases have been settled, and in 82% of those cases, the employers have not owed anything as a result of the letter. What we found are two responses when we've gone to employers. One is the forms were filled out incorrectly, so once we work with the taxpayer, there's nothing owed. And then in the other 18% of the cases, the employers have basically said, we haven't been able to determine the amount of the penalty ourselves. We were waiting to hear from you.
Okay, but we still have the admission that we can't accurately be doing this. We have an executive order not to do it, or to ease the burden, not specifically on the employer mandate, but to ease the burden that comes with this. My question to you would be, can we cease, would you agree that we need to cease the enforcement of this employer mandate until your agency at least can straighten out the mess, and for this committee to review all the documents that we've requested?
Well, I think we've done a pretty good job, Congressman, of trying to straighten out the problems that take.
But my question is, Mr. Chairman, and I know my time just expired, but the question is, this thing needs to cease until the problems are resolved and this committee gets the documents that have been requested, and until, I mean, these employers don't even know that it's been reinstituted or instituted for them.
We're trying to work with everyone who we've sent a letter out to, Congressman, and our challenge is, it's the law. And I don't think anybody in this committee wants the IRS determining which laws it's going to enforce and which ones it's going to ignore.
But it was not enforced for 8 years, and now
not.
all of a sudden it's being enforced, even with an executive order. I thank you for your graciousness, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Cannot disagree. Thank you.
Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
I thank the chair.
Wait, if you could hold for 1 second. With unanimous consent, I ask that Mr. Gianforte be allowed to participate in today's hearing, along with Mr. Duncan. Now the gentleman is recognized for his
We have no objection. Welcome to the panel. Mr. Cotter, I was just going to remind you, but you didn't need reminding, to be advised not to enforce a provision of the United States law would put you in grave jeopardy, actually. Until and unless Congress repeals the law or parts of the law, which it's tried to do and hasn't succeeded, he's all for it, I'm not, and thank God there were enough votes to block that. So it remains the law in the books, it's working, and IRS has a constitutional responsibility to uphold the law.
Yes, sir.
Is that not correct?
That is correct.
No, it was also characterized as all of a sudden, companies unaware. The law has been on the books how long?
Since 2010.
So that's how many years?
8 years.
So it's not exactly all of a sudden, is it?
No.
No, and the individual mandate idea, one might remember, came from the Heritage Foundation. In fact, when Bill Clinton was president and had a health care program, Newt Gingrich, inter alia, objected to it precisely because it lacked an individual mandate. So the idea that it's all of a sudden and a terrible thing, and the novel interpretation that the president's executive order to ease the burden could be construed as, no, suspend enforcement. Those are two very different things, are they not?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Commissioner Cotter, is it true that IRS's budget is only about 80% of what it was in 2010?
That is true.
And that's how many years ago?
That would be 8 years.
And so even with inflation, that's a big cut.
Yes, sir.
Is it also true you have 18,000 fewer employees than you did in 2010?
Yes, sir.
Could that, I'm just spitballing here, could that level, that of magnitude of cuts and employee decreases, I don't know, have anything to do with performance at IRS?
Those reductions have had an impact on the performance of the IRS. Yes, sir.
Your predecessor testified once before this committee that one of the problems plaguing IRS, besides those, that also affects performance and quality of service is aging IT systems. Is that true?
Yes, sir.
And I think he said one of them went back to one system that's still in operation went back to the administration of Lyndon Johnson. Is that true?
It does, yes, sir.
Lord Almighty. That's a long time ago. I don't know. Could you just elaborate a little bit on how aging IT systems might also, on top of budget cuts and personnel reductions, affect performance?
Certainly. The IRS hardware, of the IRS hardware, 59% of it is obsolete. 32% of its software is at least 2 updates behind, so that is out of date. The IRS systems are subject to 2.5 million cyber attacks a day.
I'm sorry, would you repeat that statistic?
The IRS systems are subject to 2.5 million cyber attacks a day, 1 million of which are sophisticated attacks. So that's on an average day.
So you're saying that works out to something, if I'm doing my math right, like $750 million a year?
Yes, sir.
Wow. Ms. Olson, concerned at all about what we're hearing?
I'm very concerned, obviously, on the cybersecurity. On the taxpayer service side, and enforcement, there's a real impact on our aging taxpayer systems, IT systems. The IRS, depending on how you count it, has between 60 to 200 case management systems where taxpayer data is stored. And how that impacts taxpayers is if you call the IRS, the person on the phone assisting you will not see the whole picture of what's going on. They may not have access to 40 of those 60 major systems. So they can't tell you. They can say, I can see that you wrote us, but I have no idea what you wrote us about, and I can't see what's being done on that.
And presumably, aging systems, Mr. Cotter and Ms. Olson, also can't be encrypted. They don't adjust to current encryption methodologies or software, and therefore they are vulnerable to the hacking you described.
They are more vulnerable. Yes, sir.
And how many Americans have data stored at the IRS?
Pretty much all.
All?
Pretty much.
So the threat's a real threat that you're dealing with every day with 2.5 million cyber attacks.
Yes, sir.
And with aging equipment, that threat is enhanced.
It is. I mean, I think, Congressman, just one point. Over recent years, what the IRS has done a pretty good job of is taking the technology money that it has, the IT money, and using it to update the core filing system so that the equipment that surrounds the core filing system is in pretty good shape. It's not as good as we'd like, but it uses old language, and it's built block upon block, so it's not as integrated as it needs to be. Where a lot of our old equipment rests is in the day-to-day functioning of the laptops that the employees have, the printers and so forth. And about 2 weeks ago, we conducted 4 calls with IRS managers, about 3,000 managers. And what impressed me was the theme that came through was a workforce that wants to do well, but feels as though it's handicapped by the tools and the equipment that it has.
Mr. Chairman, my time is up, although on a lighter note, I am informed, I hope reliably, one silver lining in legacy systems: the Chinese don't know how to hack into COBOL. I thank the chair for his indulgence.
Thank the gentleman. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank my vice chair for his eloquent opening remarks and questioning and pinch hitting. Thank all of you for coming. Obviously, many of you, this is not your first rodeo in terms of the date or when you come to try to give what I would say the annual to-do list. And Ms. Olson, I want to say thank you for your work. Obviously, you have been very responsive to my personal office, but also from a committee standpoint on helping taxpayers. And so I look forward to making sure that there is a good relationship, and I want to reinforce that, a good relationship, if not great relationship, with Ms. Olson. There has been previously, but we want to make sure that we have that going forward, and we will be looking at that very closely. Mr. Cotter, I'm assuming that you're nodding yes, that you will do that.
I have been before I joined government, I was a fan of Ms. Olson. I read her reports, her 2 reports, religiously every year, and I think she does great work.
That's great. So now in this new position, we want to make sure that you not only read her reports, but they actually get implemented. So we'll go forward from there. Ms. Olson, I would ask that, can you tell me about the false positives in terms of fraudulent reports?
Well, Mike, I stand with everyone here about stopping refund fraud and false payment, improper payments coming out from the system. But I've been concerned for the last 4 years that the false positive rate, the rate of stopping legitimate returns beyond the normal time for just being able to review them and determine, oh, this is a legitimate return. These returns to be false positive are already past that timeline. And that's what makes them a false, and then they turn out to be from legitimate taxpayers. And my concern is the way the filters and the rules are run. I think that there are almost 200 rules that are in the systems to identify these things, and I'm very concerned about their interaction. And I think that the IRS has been focusing a lot on stopping the fraud, but not enough on the refinements. And I try to keep reminding people, this is the 21st century. We have data mining techniques, artificial intelligence, all sorts of things. We can learn from past experience and focus as much on not harming the legitimate taxpayers. I've talked to tax administrations around the world, and all of them are shocked at the over 60% false positive rates.
So what do you say to that, Mr. Cotter? I mean, Mr. George, do you see that happening as well as false positives?
Yeah, while we're currently taking a look at this very issue, Mr. Meadows, and we'll be issuing a report. Oh, well, thank you. We're looking at this issue at this time, and we will be issuing a report shortly. I agree with Ms. Olson that it is an issue for anyone who is entitled to a refund not to get it. But it's also extraordinarily important that Congress keep in mind that once the IRS lets money go out the door, it is almost next to impossible to get it. So I want to give time for the Commissioner to respond, but I will say this, that the IRS itself reports that if they are able to use something called math error authority, or in effect, the ability to correct mistakes that they identify internally before the money goes out, it costs the IRS about $1.50. But once the money goes out, in order to do a pre-audit review, it's $278.
So Mr. Cotter, based on Mr. George's testimony, what would stop us from being able to do that? You need a legislative fix to help you?
I don't think it's a legislative fix, Congressman. I think it's a matter of balance. And the IRS...
A matter of what?
A balance.
Okay.
So the IRS has put in place about, as the taxpayer advocate states, about 200 filters. That may be too many, but it's this balance of trying to protect taxpayer dollars from going out the door
yeah, but when you get a 60% false positive, let me just tell you, once you go beyond 50%, you got a problem because what you have is you have the assumption that it's wrong, even though you have it kicking out as a fraudulent claim.
There's no question we need to look at it. I think we may have.
We need to do more than look at it. So, do you have a plan to address that, to bring the false positives under 50%?
I'll go back and develop a specific plan.
What would be a reasonable time frame to get a plan to this committee on how you're going to do that?
We're constantly looking at it, so I would think within, say, 2 to 3 months.
All right, so within 90 days, you can have a plan to this committee on how you're going to get false positives under 50%.
I think, yes, sir. I think we can do that.
All right. In my 11 seconds, well, I don't have any time remaining, so I'll yield back to the chairman.
We would have let you go there. We will now go to the ranking member, I think, and then we'll come to Ms. Norton, I believe, if that's all right. So the ranking member is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Jordan and Meadows and Ranking Member Connolly for facilitating this joint subcommittee hearing. And thank you to all of you for testifying today and all the audience members for coming and all of my colleagues as well. I also want to thank basically these witnesses specifically for participating in this very important hearing. In the recently passed Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, I was dismayed by my Republican colleagues' decision to cap the state and local tax deduction, otherwise known as the SALT deduction, at just $10,000 per person or family. In my district, the 8th Congressional District of Illinois, the average family files a SALT deduction of nearly $14,000 a year. Furthermore, 1 in every 3 tax filers in Illinois rely on this important deduction annually. In 2015, for example, Illinois residents deducted $1.4 billion and saved a total of $345 million on their federal tax returns thanks to SALT. As a result, our local institutions received critical funding for public services while my constituents avoided being subject to double taxation. Mr. Cotter, welcome back. I have my first question. I'm sure you've heard that before.
It's the best day of my life when that show went off TV.
Pew Charitable Trust published an interactive map illustrating the most recent SALT deduction data. This data showed that the average SALT deduction for working families in the U.S. is $12,471. First question, very, very basic. Is this number higher or lower than the devastating $10,000 cap imposed by the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act?
It would be higher.
Thank you. It is higher. It's $2,471 higher, is it not?
Yes, sir.
Well, it should come as no surprise that state and local tax jurisdictions across the country are introducing legislation to circumvent changes to the SALT deduction. Are you aware of these efforts?
Yes, sir.
And in my home state of Illinois, where $2,500 is naturally a lot of money for most hardworking families, elected officials are trying to restore full deductibility to contributions to local services. In fact, both Democratic and Republican legislators in the Illinois Assembly have proposed legislation to create the Illinois Excellence Fund, a law that will mitigate the damage caused by the Republican changes to the SALT deduction. As this legislation forges ahead and other states begin to follow suit, I sincerely hope the IRS will recognize the validity of these proposals. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
I think the gentleman, I think we'll go to Ms. Norton and then move to Mr. Grothman. Since that was sort of a combination opening statement and some questions, and we'll get back to you, Mr. Krishnamurthy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank you for this hearing. I'm particularly interested in this hearing because the Americans I represent who live in the District of Columbia pay the highest federal taxes per capita in the United States, higher than per capita than any member of this committee. And they do so without a vote on the House floor and with no vote in the Senate. We do have a vote in this committee, which I intend to use. This tax cut is not yet popular with the American people, but they will be looking for service from the IRS, and certainly my residents will be. I note that the IRS has an amazing half the number of customer services that it had in 2010. Now, I congratulate the IRS on what it has done with digital upgrading, but at the same time, the IRS has closed 30 taxpayer assistance centers, and that's, again, over the last 8 years. Mr. Cotter, does the IRS believe, for example, this is for you and Ms. Olson, that whatever digital impact we now have, that will make up for loss of half the customer service representatives and closing of 30 taxpayer assistance centers?
Thank you, Congresswoman. What the IRS is trying to do is meet taxpayers in the way they want to be met. In other words,
and you think they do not want to be met face to face, particularly now, I ask this question, when there are 100 new provisions that they've never seen before, that you've never seen before, that you got to enforce. You think that they would just as soon go online?
Oh, no, I think there's some taxpayers clearly who would prefer to be dealt with face-to-face, some that would like to be discuss issues on the phone, and then an increasing number prefer technology. The number of...
do you think taxpayers who are, let us say, over 55, 65, prefer the digital approach or face-to-face approach, Mr. Cotter?
Well, interestingly, I think most would prefer face-to-face or on the phone, but an increasing number do prefer technology.
What has the IRS done this year to make up for the fact there are going to be hordes of people coming forward to say, what do these 100 new provisions mean? Will you be able to accommodate these people with half the number of customer service representatives and with no assistance in their communities in the case of 30 of those centers that have now been closed? Are you able to accommodate this rush of need for assistance in light of what the Congress has put on your shoulders to bear?
Sure. Well, we'll try to do the best we can with the resources we have available to us.
What do you think, Ms. Olson? What will be the effect of the 100 new provisions as people try to figure out their taxes in an entirely new way for the first time?
Our survey that we did of U.S. taxpayers, representative sample of U.S. taxpayers nationwide over the last 2 years, showed that taxpayers, many will go online, but for tax law questions and tax issues like notices and needing to resolve a problem, they want to either talk to someone or they want, in-person assistance. And although there does seem to be some concentration in low income and elderly, it is really surprising how many not low income people prefer talking over the phone to resolve a problem.
Is this going to increase when there are new provisions? For example,
Absolutely.
SALT is altogether different.
Absolutely. No matter how good your system is online, people have specific circumstances, and I'm particularly concerned, that in the past the IRS has ended its tax law phone line after today.
What does that mean, please?
They have a dedicated tax law question line, and since 2014, that line has discontinued as of the last day of the filing season.
What does it do? Mr. Cotter, why is that happening, and what does it do?
In the past, it's been a matter of resources. We continue to answer certain tax law questions.
Now, these are tax law questions put by taxpayers, not lawyers, taxpayers.
That's right. And we have decided that for all of this year, we will answer questions with respect to the new tax law throughout the year.
So would this be the time you need a tax law line because there are 100 new tax laws?
Sure. And that is what we intend to do.
But the tax law line is gone as of today, according to Ms. Olson.
I guess what I was trying to say, Congresswoman, and I wasn't clear, this year we will keep that tax law line with respect to the new Tax Cuts and Jobs Act open for the entire year.
This is very important, Mr. Chairman. As I yield back my time, we have learned at this hearing that this tax law line, which was discontinued in 2014, will be renewed. And I must thank the IRS for that in light of the new tax law. And I thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, I think, just to clarify, you've had the tax law, tax question line open. It just always closed on filing date.
That's right.
But now they're going to keep it open for a longer period of time.
Right.
All right. Just to be clear, the gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized.
Yeah, first of all, we'll talk to Mr. George a little bit. Thanks for being here, first of all. You guys are always very impressive. You've issued reports last July on the IRS giving out awards to employees with serious misconduct issues. There have been examples, apparently, of employees even being removed and rehired. Could you comment on that? Do you think that's been cleared up? How can that possibly go on? What type of culture would there be where you let somebody go and then rehire them or give out bonuses to people who are engaged in misconduct?
Congressman, it was simply an issue of a lack of, I want to say common sense in some instances, but of a process that allowed the person making the hiring decision to have all of the information he or she needed regarding the candidate by their side or in the paperwork associated with the candidate's application.
So by that you mean the person who made the hiring decisions didn't have access to what the file on this person in the past?
Well, I don't necessarily want to use the word access, but they didn't have it with them while making that decision. Now, we have been told now that has changed and that the IRS has implemented policies where the hiring decision maker will have all of the relevant information relating to the candidate, especially someone who previously worked at the IRS.
Okay. I know, some people want to hire more people for the IRS. Years ago, I used to do tax returns. And at the time, sometimes you'd sticky questions and ask the IRS questions. And quite frankly, at the time, I and the other preparers almost unanimously felt that the Wisconsin Department of Revenue understood Internal Revenue Service laws better than the average IRS employee. So to me, the important thing is not hiring more employees, because what's the sense of hiring an employee if they give you the wrong answers, right? Do you guys, in your audits, do you test IRS employees to see whether they're giving right or wrong answers to inquiries?
That was a regular process that we did employ many years ago. And when we initially did this, especially at taxpayer assistance centers, the numbers were abysmal. I mean, more than 50%, almost 60% of the information or the answers given to our testers were inaccurate.
I'll cut you off just because that was a great thing. I'm going to ask you to follow up. You mean 60, and I'll believe this when I was doing taxes. That's entirely believable. You'd ask an IRS employee a tax question, 60% of the time they'd give you the wrong answer. But now continue. That would be typical of my experience 25 years ago. Go ahead.
But it has improved dramatically, though, since then. And so I don't have the latest figures. We can supply that for the record. But it has improved tremendously. And we don't do it every single year in terms of having people visit taxpayer assistance centers. So I will supply that information for the record.
Okay, do you have a guess? I mean, I know you don't know exactly. 30% wrong, 20%?
Sir, if I might add,
sure.
One of the ways it improved was that the IRS then, after those abysmal numbers, it took a whole bunch of more complex questions and put them in what they call out of scope. So the numbers improved because the IRS just simply refused to answer questions that it was getting wrong.
Well, like schools.
Yes, there you go. And so one of the things that we're going to do this summer is we're going to be testing, my office is going to be calling the tax law line, posing some typical questions relating to the new tax law to see how they're being answered, or are they even in scope?
That's a real good idea. You know, it is worse. If you're hiring new people who don't know the tax law, that's worse than hiring nobody at all, correct? We all agree on that? Yeah. And you know, if you're in an audit or if the IRS audits you and asks for more money and interest and penalties in this, and you say, well, this is the way the IRS told me to fill out the return, what does the IRS do? I know what they do, right? What will the IRS do to you?
You know, one side effect of the funding or just priorities is that the training for the employees in the Wage and Investment Division who answer the phones last year was $87 per employee. That's it.
Wow, okay. Go ahead.
But I found, sir, they're not draconian. If you can, reasonably state and point to a time when you called into the IRS and the information that they provided you, they will take that into consideration. That's anecdotal, but that is still my understanding.
Thank you.
Now to turn to the gentlelady from New York, or Ms. Lawrence, excuse me. Ms. Lawrence is up first.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Sorry.
I have a question for Mr. Cotter. As we know, the new tax law, I feel strongly, does a lot of damage to our community. It's in Michigan, the poorest 20% of families will pay $120 more in taxes by the year 2027, and the richest will pay 1%. However, working women, and I sent a letter to Jean DeLaro outlining the impact that this law will have on women and low-income families, because working women represents the largest portion of low-income working people in America. However, you've stressed that you're reducing the assistance centers. And is the IRS planning specific outreach and assistance to vulnerable groups to better assist them in the next tax season, including working women and mothers? Can you tell me the details of what the new outreach campaigns, community work, advertising, and new materials have you planned?
Sure. About 19% of the funds we've asked for to implement tax reform involves outreach to taxpayers. We're in the process of developing the detailed plan, so I don't have those details at this point as to which groups we will reach out to and in which manner.
So you don't know who you're reaching out to, you just know you need to do it.
We're developing the plan at the moment. Yes, ma'am.
So through the chair, it is important that we know who you're reaching out to and what the plan is. And I don't expect the plan to be 2 days before the next tax season. So what is the date for the new plan?
It should be developed by early summer, so I would think mid-June at the latest, probably before then.
I want you to know that I'm very concerned because I get calls in my congressional office. We're talking about the accuracy of information that the employees are given, but actually getting to a person is an extreme challenge right now, and it's frustrating, especially for those. Ms. Olson, you know that the lack of, go online is not an option to a lot of people and to our seniors. It is extremely challenging. And so while you have to have a sense of the challenge that the public is having now just to get to resources, and it's not acceptable.
There are only about 390 IRS employees charged with doing outreach and education to individual taxpayers. The 150 million U.S. individual taxpayers. There are only about 96 IRS employees charged with doing outreach and education of small businesses and self-employed. And that goes to the cuts to pre-filing assistance and education and outreach, being in the communities. And it's not just about telling taxpayers what the law is, but hearing from them what their challenges are so that then you can do better online materials, better pubs.
And Ms. Olson, that gets back to Mr. Cotter. It doesn't do us any good if you create a plan that is not going to solve the problem. And we have a serious problem. We implemented a tax plan. We have cut the workforce in the IRS. We have now not done our outreach. We're doing a plan. And I'm telling you, I'm very, very concerned.
Thank you, Congresswoman. I agree. We need a meaningful plan that reaches those folks who need help. Let me just say with respect to the phones, this filing season, the average wait time has been about 6 minutes. Last year it was 7. This year it's 6 minutes. In addition, we're looking at some features like amending the phone assistance line so taxpayers know how long the wait is and to add a callback feature. So I think there are some things we can do that are fairly straightforward that we need to do, but the numbers I have at the moment say the average wait time so far this busy season has been about 6 minutes.
If I could, you say some of these taxpayers can be helped by the phone, but in 2018, 33 million calls have been made to the IRS, and only 6.4 million have been answered by a real person or a tax assistant. This information is what we have, and you're saying it's 6 minutes to an answer, and so many of these people aren't even getting an answer.
Many folks, when they call the telephone numbers, are prompted to see if their question can be answered by a recorded message. And many taxpayers opt out of talking to a live person and go to a recorded message with respect to the topic they're interested in.
My time, I've gone over, but I just want to close with this. The reduction in the workforce. We cannot continue to say that we have this overall objective in our philosophy and our values if you don't have the workforce and the trained workforce to perform the job. It is not acceptable for you as the leadership to not bring that to Congress and be truthful about what is happening. It's one thing to try to be appeasing in these hearings. It's another thing for us to hear the truth. And I hear from those federal employees who are inundated with lack of resources and technology, without having enough resources to perform the job that they swore and took an oath to. And I'm going to continue to push this and not sit here and listen to we're trying and our philosophy is to perform the job when we know we're not. We have to roll up our sleeve and fix this. And I yield back. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, with your indulgence, Mr. Cotter, Ms. Lawrence makes a very good point. I used to manage a phone center. There is no way possible that your sworn testimony right now is accurate based on if her numbers are accurate in terms of the number of calls that went unanswered, there's no way that 6 minutes is the average wait time, because so I would ask you to maybe before you enter that into the record is go back and look at that and let's make sure we get accurate information. I'm just telling you.
Yes, sir. Well, I will confirm that, but I would also say many people, as I mentioned, many people opt out of.
I get that, but even with that, if there's that many unanswered phone calls, there's no way that it can be 6 minutes, Mr. Cotter. I used to manage a phone center.
Yes, sir.
Appreciate the gentleman. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, there's always an impossible question, but Mr. Cotter, I'm going to ask you the impossible question. Today, how can the American people know that a Lois Lerner couldn't do again what she did to so many Americans?
That is a hard question. Thank you. I think the IRS.
And by the way, after you, I'm going to Inspector General to ask the same question.
But having been there 5 months, I'll give you my impression. I think over the last couple of years, the IRS has implemented a number of changes with respect to reporting structures and with respect to annual evaluations to make sure that these sorts of things don't happen again. And it's a matter of, it's partly the people you hire, it's partly the processes that you have in place. And I think the IRS has tried to be judicious in who it hires, and it has tried to be pretty deliberate about its annual review process and structurally and through HR processes. Thank you.
Mr. George, as you know, Lois Lerner had already abused people when she was at the Federal Election Commission. She'd already testified before Congress, this committee, in the 90s, that going after the Republican Party of Florida and not the Democratic Party of Florida for the exact same illegal donors' money, that in fact she was already a bad actor with a long history who wasn't, it's not surprising, hated Republicans, hated conservatives, was a strident Democrat activist. So I appreciate the commissioners, we got to hire better, but from a system standpoint, which is what you look at so often, from a system standpoint, where are the checks and balances? Who is it besides yourself, sometimes locked out of the process, but who is it besides yourself that in fact is the watchdog to look for these and early on stop the kind of abuses that Lois Lerner did for most of the Obama administration?
It is not a single point of contact, Congressman. It starts from the hiring of the person to the management of that person during the process and to looking at the results that that person achieves or doesn't achieve. It's a multifaceted enterprise. The bottom line is it is impossible to stop someone who with ill intent who can put on a facade that will get them through the door, get them access to sensitive information, and then allow them to engage in egregious behavior. So it does require at all times people monitoring the activity of their subordinates and of supervisors. And when you see something wrong, you have to say something about it.
Well, let me, as you know, the groups that were being asked absurd questions, sometimes unlawful questions, and not being granted their status, were saying things, but it went on deaf ears at the time. It was a process. There was no one to complain to, essentially, within the process. So let me ask you sort of a related question that I want to get to Ms. Olson. If somebody is guilty of sexual harassment at the IRS, do you today have a process that only takes one offense, one claim, in order to open an active investigation and go to the bottom of that to prevent it from happening a second time?
It is a very fact-specific answer. If it's something that occurred outside of the workplace and is within local law authority jurisdiction, we have to be deferential to the separation of federal state.
But I'm talking about on the work site, if somebody does something that would qualify for that, there is, in most of the agencies, a fairly rapid response where for political leaning wrongdoing, it is less obvious. Is that a fair statement?
That is a fair statement, but again, if it's administrative versus criminal, that's a distinction that has to be made. But that problem does exist within the IRS, as you know.
Ms. Olson, I'm using those two examples because they do seem like they're both important and they both have to be dealt with systematically. Right. As an outsider looking in, what should we know?
You know, I've thought a lot about my organization's role in that whole process. We had 19 cases come in over 2.5 years dealing with C4 issues out of 1 million cases. And it's really hard to see a pattern with that. But I have really thought that most of those taxpayers complain to their congressional offices, and we really need to rely on the congressional office to raise to my office. When you see those kinds of cases and those kinds of concerns, get them to us, because if they really are, then I can get them to the Inspector General, or we can delve into, is it just an employee who doesn't understand? Is it leadership? What is it? And where does it need to go? Because 19 out of 1 million, I'm not going to see a pattern, but if they come from a congressional office, that will help us. They will be better developed. You know, and maybe we'll get more than 19. That will at least be a protection going forward.
Excellent. Thank you. Yield back.
I thank the gentleman. The gentlelady from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to all the panelists. First, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to place in the record a letter from epic.org to the chairman of the committee, the Electronic Privacy Information Center.
Without objection.
Thank you. My first question is to IG George. Good to see you again. I know you used to work for the committee, and it's nice to see your presence here with us today. For years, the IRS has struggled to keep the information technology systems up to date and in line with industry standards. And so my question to you is, how does aging IT threaten the IRS's ability to do its job?
This question was addressed slightly earlier in more detail, but I'll give you from my perspective. What aging IT depends, of course, on the particular system you're referring to. So, for example, a laptop could be considered aged after 3 years. A mainframe, it could be 5 to 10 years. And then, of course, you have the master file and the CADE. And as you are aware, because you've been involved in this issue for many years, they're still using software or language from the 1960s. So it is a problem, especially if you try to adapt to a 21st century environment. So the IRS had many grand plans for modernization to make it easier for taxpayers to identify their tax obligation and to comply with it. And unfortunately, because of budgetary constraints, they've had to make hard choices. And that some of those, again, include whether to implement extenders or now a very new tax law change, largest in 30 years, or provide more customer service, people answering phones, or, and this is an area that really hasn't been touched upon, but going after people who owe money. In other words, doing examinations and audits. I mean, it's almost at a record low, and the IRS, hence the American taxpayers, the honest taxpayers, are being harmed because the IRS has to have made very tough decisions, and which I don't necessarily fault them on because of, again, the lack of resources that they have.
Well, it really hurts IT workers because they're very much in demand and they're very well paid. And I can imagine that it's hard to recruit them, and you need them in order to modernize for the 21st century. And one of the biggest sticking problems has been the IRS's inability to hire and retain experienced IT workers and professionals because of the pay gap. And I know from '98 to 2013, the IRS was able to address this by hiring 40 individuals under what is known as the Streamlined Critical Pay Authority. So I'd like to ask the acting commissioner, is it accurate to say that the IRS filled a total of 168 positions critical to this area of IT over the past 15 years by using this program, but I understand the program has expired and that you can no longer hire from this program, and what has that meant to the agency?
You're exactly right, Congresswoman. The ability to hire and the streamlined critical pay was enacted in 1998. Between then and 2017, we had, I think the actual number is 171 people that we hired under that program. We were authorized to hire 40 people at a time. The most we ever had was 30. The last person on that program left in September of 2017. Under streamlined critical pay, which we've asked for the last 3 years, we would be able to hire somebody in 6 weeks, which now takes 6 months, and we'd be able to pay them competitively, which we cannot do at the moment. So our ability to deal with data analytics, cybersecurity, and other critical technology needs is limited at the moment.
So you're right now that authority's expired, so you are calling for it to be re-implemented, that this would help you address many of the issues that we're talking about today.
Yes, ma'am. It's included in the President's budget.
It's included in his budget?
It is in the budget.
Oh, that's, and Mr. George?
I would just add, though, there is a secondary hiring authority that that is government-wide that can be used. The difference is the pay differential. Under the special authority that the IRS had, they could pay substantially more, up to the vice president's salary, whereas under the existing program, it's less, but it's rarely used in government. And I don't believe the IRS at this time has anyone.
Right.
Authority.
But you say this authority is in the President's budget.
It is,
but
yes.
the funding is not in the President's budget. Is that the problem?
It's included for the fiscal 19 budget, so it was also in 18 and it wasn't included in the final bill.
Okay. Well, my time has expired. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. The gentleman from Montana is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for letting me sit in today, and to the committee being here on tax day. This is game day for the IRS. So,
yes, sir.
Yeah. Ms. Olson, your testimony, you discuss metrics for customer service regarding taxpayer phone calls. Have those metrics been improving or getting worse over the last 3 years?
So it depends on what your metric is. If you're looking at the level of service on the phone, the percentage of calls that are answered, the calls from taxpayers who want to speak to a live human being on the main phone line, that has been improving. My observation has been that it's been improving at the expense of other phone lines, and the measure doesn't reflect a comprehensive measure of all the phone lines the IRS has. The other thing that we did this year is that we did a survey of private sector, private industry customer service practices and the measures that they used. And based on our research, which we reported in my annual report, the most important measure that they used was first contact resolution rate. The IRS doesn't measure that. And when we did find some measures just from surveys, our survey, we found that the vast majority of taxpayers did not have their issue, resolved on the first point of contact.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Olson. Mr. Cotter, I know you're acting head for just 5 months, so you're just getting started. So I want to tell you a little story. Prior to being here, I built a technology business focused on customer service. And we had about 2,000 major corporations all over the world, including 170 federal agencies that we work with. We handled about 8 million customer interactions a day on behalf of our clients. And our mission was really to help organizations instrument and improve customer service. That's what we did. So I want to talk to you for a part of my time here about how you're driving a culture of customer service within IRS. So the first question, who is in charge, who on your executive team is responsible for customer experience?
I think it's the commissioner. Frankly, it's me. Yes, sir.
So you have no one on your team whose sole focus is customer experience?
In the executive team, we don't, that is a responsibility of
That's fine,
everyone on the
Mr. So
executive team.
I would just encourage you to consider that. What, if you had to name the top 2 or 3 customer service metrics that are important to the agency, what would they be?
I think the first one would be the level of assistance in complying with the law, and I think it would be a broader measure than just phone response. In other words,
So you think citizens are happiest if you're following the law?
I think it's assisting citizens to comply with the law. So it's providing advice to taxpayers in a way that's meaningful to them.
Do you have a dashboard from this individual that's responsible for customer service that shows you how you're doing on the most important metrics, and how often do you review those metrics?
Yeah, I do not believe we've got a dashboard at the moment.
Okay. Let me switch topics for a second. In your opening testimony, you said that 92% of taxpayers are filing online. And you also testified that the website is down today. So in a real sense, this is game day for the IRS, and it seems the IRS can't get out of the locker room. So my question for you is, on the biggest day of the year for the IRS, how did you prepare for game day, and why were those preparations deficient?
Sure. So we have, well, first of all, taxpayers can continue to prepare their returns and submit them to their electronic, so TurboTax and Intuit. They can continue. The challenge we've got is between the transmission from the software providers, H&R Block, Intuit, to the IRS systems. So taxpayers will be unaffected at the moment. They can file, fill out the return, give it to their submitter. And then the challenge is the transmission, as I said, between that processor and the IRS. We have backup systems that we are bringing up online. And I haven't had an update since we've been in the hearing. But hopefully we will have that issue resolved quickly.
Okay, I did get an update, and it says that the IRS direct payment system is down, which means people cannot pay the IRS currently. I would just, you know, clearly we understand the significance of this. There's generally, for most Americans, there's one day they interact with the IRS. It's today, and the system that by your testimony, 92% of Americans use is not available. So with that, my time's up, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. George, has the IRS hired people who they've previously fired?
Yes.
And in one instance, there were specific instructions not to rehire this individual who they had previously fired. Is that accurate?
That is my understanding, yes.
And does the IRS give bonuses to their employees?
Yes, they do.
And in 2016, wasn't there approximately 1,000 employees at the Internal Revenue Service who had trouble paying their taxes on time or had some kind of tax complication of their own who received a bonus?
That is correct.
And last year, isn't it true that there were approximately 2,000 employees at the IRS who got bonuses, and yet during the year they'd had some kind of disciplinary action against them?
Correct, sir.
So, Commissioner, when you talk about the critical pay, streamlined critical pay, you got to remember the background. And there's a reason why, I just went through a few of them, why the Congress is a little reluctant to give you this ability to hire whomever you want and pay them just about whatever you want in light of what we just went through with Mr. George.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it is indefensible to be in the position that the IRS has been in. Back in 2014, Mr. George's organization made a series of recommendations, all of which we implemented. We stopped about 80% of the payments that would have gone to people who had performance problems. We didn't stop 100%. In February, Mr. George's organization made 3 more recommendations, which we have implemented. But it is indefensible for those types of payments to be made.
Yeah,
it shouldn't be.
And again, I appreciate that. I appreciate the fact that you as the interim commissioner understand how the American taxpayer looks at this. 2,000 employees with disciplinary actions getting a bonus of their hard-earned tax money. 1,000 employees who can't file their taxes right getting a bonus when they're in the business of collecting the tax money from the American taxpayer. And then for you to ask for, oh, but by the way, we got to have this streamlined critical pay ability to pay folks way above the federal pay scale, which frankly a lot of Americans think is too high already. That is just tough. And I don't know that you're going to find a receptive audience, at least with Republicans, on that issue. We'll look at it. Now, how about we talked earlier, Mr. Heiss, and I know he wants to come back to it, the employer mandate. So Obamacare is passed in 2010. It starts to be implemented in 2013, but the employer mandate for small businesses was not implemented, was not enforced until just the end of last year. Is that right?
Sure. Yes, sir.
That's the history. Yep. And so what happened at just the end of last year where suddenly it was Shazam, we got to enforce it now?
Sure.
Mr. Koskinen's got one foot out the door, and all of a sudden, the last thing he does before he officially leaves as the commissioner is say, we're going to now enforce something that we haven't since the law passed 7 years prior, and we haven't since it's been in effect, in essence, since 2013, but suddenly we're going to do it.
Sure. So let me give you the chronology as I understand it. The employer mandate was deferred until taxable year 2015. The information returns required in 2015 were due June of 2016. When the IRS got that data, there were about 330 applicable large employers who could be subject to the penalty. So June of 2016, IRS has the data to determine who's provided coverage and who hasn't. It was not ready, frankly, to process those effectively. It took about 15 months for it to determine that the population of employers likely to owe the mandate is about 33,000. To date, so it started to send those notices. So June of 2016, they've got the information. It takes them about 15 months to process it. November, before I get to the IRS, the notices go out. At this point, about 10,000 notices have gone out. Potential population is about 33,000 employers who have said they haven't provided coverage. The notices are based on the data that was submitted by the employers in 2016. Of the 10,000 letters that have gone out, about 3,000 cases have been settled. And of those 3,000, as I mentioned earlier, 82%, right? So we sent letters out saying it looks like this amount is owed. In those 3,000 cases that we've settled, 82% of those, the employer owed nothing. And in part, the forms have been filled out incorrectly. So as I said, we've gotten two responses in general in the cases where we've talked to taxpayers. One is we filled out the paperwork incorrectly or a third-party processor filled it out incorrectly. And the other 18% has been pretty much, we knew we didn't provide coverage, we knew we owed the penalty, and we were waiting to find out how much it was because we can't determine it on our own.
I'm going to go to the gentleman from Georgia for some follow-up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I do want to continue down this line of thought, and I regret that the gentleman from Virginia was not able to follow my reasoning and thought with this. I in no way am asking you or anyone else not to abide by the law, but the fact is the law has not been followed. It's not been enforced for 8 years, requiring the employer mandate, and then all of a sudden, it's by your own sworn testimony, without any notification, it's implemented, and businesses are facing penalties without any notification that it's now being implemented. So it's wrong. It is wrong yesterday, it's wrong today, it'll be wrong tomorrow for us basically to communicate that this law is not going to be enforceable and then all of a sudden start penalizing them for not being in compliance. That is the point. And for that reason, we ought to continue not enforcing it until we get our act together here, until these employers are notified that this is going to be enforced. And what are the total number of companies not in compliance? What's the universe?
Our estimate for 2015 is about 33,000.
All right, 33,000, which I find very difficult to believe, to be very honest with you. Do you know how many businesses there are in America that employ over 50 people?
I believe it's about 330, 340,000.
Okay, by my rough estimates, there's, and this is by 2010, the 2010 census, there are almost 28 million businesses, small businesses, that employ less than 50 people. Treasury says that 96% are less than 50 people. That means 4% or 50% or more. That's over 1 million. Over 1 million companies that employ over 50 people. Now, you say 33,000 are not in compliance. Am I supposed to believe, then, that we have a law that we say is not going to be enforced, and yet only 33,000 out of 1 million are not in compliance? That you've got almost 1 million companies out there complying with a law that they're told they don't need to comply with. It doesn't add up.
I will go back and check our numbers, Congressman.
But it doesn't add up. Any number that it is, you say 500,000, whatever number it is, are we really to believe that these companies are complying with a law that they've already been told they don't need to comply with because it's not going to be enforced?
Well, from the data that I've seen, the vast majority of companies do provide health care coverage for their employees. And so the 330,000 is the number of applicable large employers that are not providing the coverage.
The numbers don't add up to me, and I want to get to the bottom of all of this, because how in the world do you pick 10,000 out of 1 million, and that you say, and even by your own statements right here, even if that's correct, 33,000 are not in compliance, but we're only reaching out to 10,000 of those. How do we determine which 10,000 or whatever number it may be that we're going to pick on?
It's been we've looked at those employers who clearly state they do not provide coverage. And so we've started with them, and then we are with a group of those, and we're continuing to send out letters periodically. And
so we start with them and say, you're now under penalty for not complying with the law that we said you didn't have to comply with yet because it's not going to be enforced. Well, I mean, that whole concept is wrong.
Well, Congressman, the letter is not an assessment. The letter says, based on the data that we have in front of us, it looks like you owe this amount. And then there is a discussion, and as I said, in 82% of these 3,000 cases that we've settled, it's been agreed that the employer didn't owe anything.
I understand that. Here's part of my problem with all this, and it's just part of the problem. We, under Commissioner Koskinen, we know that there was targeting of certain groups and individuals. All right, and the last thing Koskinen does when he leaves is instate a law that has previously been not enforced. How do we know that this 10,000 is not still targeting certain groups? We've got 1 million companies out here, and we're supposed to believe that they've all been complying with something that they have been communicated that's not going to be enforced. The numbers don't add up, and then all of a sudden we've got 10,000 of them that we are penalizing. I want to know, how do you pick these? And I hear what you're saying, but the whole thing just smells fishy. Sure. I think we need to back up and make sure we know what we're doing before we start imposing penalties on companies that have been communicated just the opposite.
I think that's fair, Congressman, and let me get more detail to you.
Thank you, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Commissioner, we sent you a letter a week and a half ago that goes right to what the gentleman from Georgia was asking about, so we're waiting for, I believe we're still waiting for you guys to respond. So the responses and the documents we requested will go a long way, I think, into clearing up the very real concerns that the gentleman has. With that, I would turn to, well, let me just ask, do you anticipate us getting those response and the documents sometime soon?
We do. We had a good conversation with the staff yesterday, and I think we can get most of the information you requested to you pretty quickly.
That'd be important. Thank you. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Cotter, let me come back to the customer service side of things, because the gentleman from Montana was asking you some unique questions, and when you answered the way you did, it gave me a real concern, mainly because I've been to the IRS. I've talked to some of your employees, and I found the vast majority, in fact, the overwhelming majority of them want to just serve this country and do their job. And yet, if we're not placing an importance on customer service, you will continue to get bad customer service. And it's partly because of the system that we've created that creates a bad customer service. I don't know that it's, I didn't see anybody sitting back eating bonbons when I was there. I mean, they were actually working, and so in doing that, how can you expect good customer service if you don't have a senior level person with the responsibility of the customer experience like the gentleman from Montana outlined.
I think his point's an excellent point.
All right, so here's my request of you. If you would take some of your senior officials and you require them to call into the same phone center that we have to call into, make it mandatory. The punishment of them having to do that alone would require them to do things differently. I promise you. Let me just tell you, you have no idea what it's like to call in and get the type of, I've also often said in the private sector, if CEOs would only go into their own phone system, they would change it immediately, because there are certain companies, and I won't name them in this public forum, that I don't do business with just because I can't get to anybody. And I would say that the IRS, it's a systemic problem. Ms. Olson would agree with that. I've talked to her a number of times on that. So why don't we do that? Well, would you agree in this particular venue to take your top 10 senior officials and make them call in at random and during random hours for the customer service experience, and then report back to Congress in 90 days on what they found?
I will do that, Congressman. I will tell you, I was a tax practitioner for 40 years. And believe it or not, the telephone service today is remarkably better than it had been, which is not to say it's where it should be. And I think it has to start at the top. I think it has to start with a commissioner who emphasizes taxpayer service. And as I tried to emphasize in my oral statement, it's got to be infused in everything this agency does.
All right, let me go to the issue that the gentleman from Ohio and Georgia has mentioned on the mandate and the enforcement. Do you enforce every single law that you have with the same priorities?
I would hope so. I mean, I would hope that we implement everything within the Internal Revenue Code.
Well, maybe since this is your first hearing, I will give you a swing and a miss on that particular answer. Does the IRS, let me ask it a different way, put a different priority on who they go after, on who they audit? Is there a matrix of which there is going after those who they think might be the problem?
Sure. The tax-paying population is segmented with respect to a selection for audit. So, for example, in the individual, for individuals, the likelihood of being audited for someone who makes more than $1 million
But you have a criteria, is my point.
No, it is very detailed.
So in your testimony a few minutes ago, what was really troubling is it sounded like you were going after the people that were honest with you and said we didn't provide it, and the other 23,000 you didn't.
No, I didn't mean
That's
that
what
at
it
all.
sounded like.
No, then I'm sorry. I did not properly convey. The plan is to approach all 33,000.
But you went after the 10,000 that admitted that they were not providing it first, because they were the most honest with you. So you went after the first 10,000 that said, hey, by the way, we didn't provide it.
We went after those who were clearly in violation of the law.
But by their own admission.
By their own admission.
But that's my whole point. So the 23,000 that make it more difficult for you, they're getting a little bit of delayed action.
Not much, but yes, sir, a little bit.
Okay. So the ones who admitted that they had it, and here's the interesting thing that both the gentlemen have been making. The IRS did not have their act together as it related to this particular implementation of this particular law. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So inaction and inability on the part of IRS creates a crisis for the taxpayer? Is that something it should, do you see that as fair?
Well, I don't think it's fair for taxpayers to be disadvantaged when the IRS can't function properly. I just do not think that's fair.
So this is a question of fairness to me. As we start to look at this, we've got 10,000 people who say we didn't do it, we wanted to comply, by the way, we didn't provide the insurance. And so those are the ones that won't complain to Ms. Olson. It's the other 23,000 that will. And so when we look at that, are they getting treated differently because they've admitted that they didn't do it versus the one who didn't?
By the time the process is completed, all 33,000 that we've identified.
That's not the question I asked. Are they getting treated differently? Did you send out the same demand letters to all 33,000?
All 33,000 will get the same letter. It's just a matter
Did
of
you?
timing.
You're answering a good question that I didn't ask. Did you send out the same response to all 33,000 at the same time? How about that?
We did not send 33,000
So
out
people
on the
are
same
getting
day.
treated differently.
In that sense, yes, sir.
Okay. Here's what I would ask you to do, because you seem like a fair guy. I would ask you to relook at this with some of your senior officials and work with the National Taxpayer Advocacy Group, with Ms. Olson's group, because here's what we're creating a situation that individual taxpayers are getting treated differently based on their response, but we're also creating a situation where ultimately, because of our inability to implement a law, that they are getting perhaps penalties that they wouldn't normally get because of our inability for 15 months, according to your sworn testimony, that we didn't have our act together. It is bad enough when we have a law that is clear and it gets implemented that we go after people, but it's really bad when it's not clear and we're holding them accountable. Can you relook at that for this committee?
Yes, sir.
All right, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized. Oh, okay. Well, I'll do a couple quick things. All right. I appreciate that. Commissioner, the Office of Professional Responsibility, Office of Personnel Management has indicated that there are approximately 250,000 federal employees whose salaries are now redacted compared to 3,400 that were in the previous year. A number of those redactions are IRS employees, and now taxpayers can't see what some people are actually making. Do you know what the number is of IRS employees who fall into that category?
I do not. Sorry, I just became aware of the issue late yesterday, so I just don't. I can get back to the committee on that.
Okay, we'd appreciate that, knowing the number of folks there. Let me do one other quick thing. There was a memorandum of understanding that the IRS was exempt from the typical OIRA rulemaking process. My understanding is you guys that is no longer in existence as of just a few weeks ago. Is that accurate?
That is correct. Last week, we reached agreement, Treasury Department reached agreement with OMB on a new memorandum of understanding, which I think strikes a pretty good balance between greater OMB review of regulations that might impose a burden on the American public, while letting Treasury get regulations out in a timely fashion. So it was a very thoughtfully negotiated agreement, and I think it's going to be pretty effective.
Okay. Well, we appreciate that step, what I would consider a step in the right direction. It's my understanding, though, that the IRS still, most of the regulations you view as interpretive versus actually rulemaking requirements, and therefore still a bunch of what you do doesn't go through the typical rulemaking authority. I see Ms. Olson nodding her head. So I would hope we can improve that as we go forward as well.
Sure. What the Office of Management and Budget typically reviews are regulations. So regulations have the force and effect of law once finalized, and so OMB has looked at those for decades. There's a lot of what's called sub-regulatory guidance that is issued by the Internal Revenue Service, which are expressions of the IRS view of the law. So fact sheets, frequently asked questions, revenue rulings, and those are not typically subject to review by the Office of Management and Budget, and they were specifically considered as part of this negotiation.
Right, but you can obviously see the problem. If you as the agency get to define what you believe is interpretive and guidance and don't have to follow the rules, even though you've got rid of the memorandum of understanding, which exempted you from all of it in the first place, but now you're not, it's basically the same difference.
Yes, sir. That is not our intent.
Okay.
Yep.
Gentleman from North Carolina.
So, Mr. Cotter, can you give us a copy of this new MOU?
Yes, sir.
All right. If you'll do that, the gentleman from Ohio's point is this. I know the IRS has had a unique, and I want to thank you for working with OMB to look at a more transparent regulatory process. If you're, as you called it, I guess, what was this, sub-regulation?
Sub-regulatory guidance.
Yeah. That's a unique one for the IRS. Normally they call it guidance in other areas, but if it has the function of law, i.e., somebody's going to get audited and a penalty would be attached to that, then it would still come under the review process. Is that your?
Yes, sir. That is correct.
All right. I yield back. I thank the gentleman.
I thank the gentleman. We look forward to getting that memorandum. I would just say, Mr. Commissioner, I think you got a tough job. God bless you for taking it on, even for whatever length of time until Mr. Rettig is confirmed. But when you have an agency that has rehired people that were specifically told not to rehire, it's given bonuses to people who actually haven't paid their taxes, given bonuses to people who have been disciplined. I mean, I just think you got a tough job, and particularly in light of what we just witnessed with the previous commissioner and what took place at the IRS over the last several years and the whole targeting scandal. But I feel like I have confidence that you're going to do it right and get us the information we need in a timely fashion. So I want to thank all of you for the work you do. Ms. Olson, Mr. George, for the numerous times you've appeared before this committee with important information for the American taxpayer. And Commissioner, thank you for being with us today. And with that, we're adjourned.
Thank you.